Hello. Today I'm going to be reading chapters 15, 16, and maybe 17 of E.Tulane. And he has just been separated from Bull and Lucy when he was thrown off the train that they were sleeping on. What do you guys think? How is this story going to evolve? Is he going to reunite with Bull, Lucy, the people he loves, Abilene? How will Pellegrina play a role in this story? Let's keep reading and find out. Chapter 15. In the morning the sun rose, and the cricket song gave way to a bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. She said. She paused it. She pushed at Edward with her fishing pole. Looks like a rabbit, she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Edward. Only he ain't real. She stood back up. She said again. She rubbed her back. What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has its use. That's what I say. Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he had felt the night before had gone away and had been replaced with a different feeling, one of hollowness and despair. Pick me up or don't pick me up, the rabbit thought, makes no difference to me. The old lady picked him up. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish, and then she kept walking, swinging the basket and singing. Nobody knows the troubles I've seen. Edward, in spite of himself, listened. I've seen troubles too, he thought. You bet I have, and apparently they aren't over yet. Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She hung him from a pole in her vegetable garden. She nailed his velvet ears to the wooden pole and spread his arms out as if he were flying, and attached his paws to the pole by wrapping pieces of wire around them. In addition to Edward, pie tins hung from the pole. They clinked and clanked and shone in the morning sun. Ain't a doubt in my mind that you can scare them off, the lady said. Scare who off? Edward wondered. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows. They came flying at him, cawing and screeching, wheeling over his head, diving at his ears. Go on, Clyde, said the woman. She clapped her hands. You've got to act ferocious. Clyde? Edward felt a weariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually be able to sigh out loud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. Get to work, Clyde, she said. Scare them birds off. And then she walked away from him out of the garden and toward her small house. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at the loose threads in his sweaters. One large crow in particular would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on the pole and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear. Caw, 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 without ceasing. As the sun rose higher and shone meaner and brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrina. Go ahead, he thought. Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't care. I'm done with caring. Caw, caw, said the Pellegrina crow. Finally, the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his velvet ears and looked up at the night sky. He saw the stars, but for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. You're down there alone, the stars seemed to say to him, and we're up here in our constellations together. I have been loved, Edward told the stars. So, said the stars, what difference does that make when you're all alone now? Edward could think of no answer to that question, and eventually the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned, and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with her. Chapter 16. Bryce, said the old woman, get away from that rabbit. I ain't paying you to stand and stare. Yes, ma'am, said Bryce. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and continued to look up at Edward. The boy's eyes were brown with flecks of gold shining in them. Hey, he whispered to Edward. A crow settled on Edward's head and the boy flapped his arms and shouted, Go on, get! And the bird spread his wings and flew away. Bryce, shouted the old woman. Ma'am, said Bryce. Get away from that rabbit. Do your work. I ain't going to say it again. Yes'm, said Bryce. He wiped his hand across his nose. I'll be back to get you, he said to Edward. The rabbit spent the day hanging by his ears, baking in the hot sun, watching the old woman and Bryce weed and hoe the garden. Whenever the woman wasn't looking, Bryce raised his hand and waved. The birds circled over Edward's head, laughing at him. What was it like to have wings? Edward wondered. If he had had wings when he was tossed overboard, he would not have sunk to the bottom of the sea. Instead, he would have flown in the opposite direction, up and into the deep, bright blue sky. And when Lolly took him up to the dump, he would have flown out of the garbage and followed her and landed on her head, holding on with his sharp claws. And on the train, when the man kicked him, Edward would not have fallen to the ground. Instead, he would have risen up and sat on the top of the train and laughed at the man. Caw, caw, caw. In the late afternoon, Bryce and the old lady left the field. Bryce winked at Edward as he walked past him. One of the crows lighted on Edward's shoulder and tapped with his beak at Edward's china face, reminding the rabbit with each tap that he had no wings, and that not only could he not fly, he could not move on his own at all in any way. Dusk descended over the field, and then came true dark. A whippoorwill sang out over and over again, "Whippoorwill, whippoorwill." It was the saddest sound Edward had ever heard. Then came another sound, the hum of a harmonica. Bryce stepped out of the shadows. "Hey," he said to Edward. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and then played another bit of song on the harmonica. "I bet you didn't think I'd come back, but here I am. I came to save you." Too late, thought Edward as Bryce climbed the pole and worked at the wires that were tied around his wrists. "I'm nothing but a hollow rabbit." Too late, thought Edward as Bryce pulled the nails out of his ears. "I'm only a doll made of china." But when the last nail was out and he fell forward into Bryce's arms, the rabbit felt a rush of relief, and the feeling of relief was followed by one of joy. Perhaps, he thought, it's not too late, after all, for me to be saved. Chapter 17. Bryce slung Edward over his shoulder. He started to walk. "I come to get you for Sarah Ruth," Bryce said. "You don't know Sarah Ruth. She's my sister. She's sick. She had her baby doll made out of china. She loved that baby doll, but he broke it. He broke it. He was drunk and stepped on that baby's head and smashed it into 100 million pieces. Them pieces was so small I couldn't make them go back together. I just couldn't. I tried and I tried." I wonder who he is. Maybe their father. At this point in the story, Bryce stopped walking and shook his head and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "Sarah Ruth ain't had nothing to play with since. He won't buy her nothing. He says she don't need nothing. He says she don't need nothing because she ain't gonna live. But he don't know." Bryce started to walk again. "He don't know," he said. Who he was not clear to Edward. What was clear was that he was being taken to a child to make up for the loss of a doll. A doll. How Edward loathed dolls. That means he hates dolls. And to be thought of as a likely replacement for a doll offended him. But still, it was, he had to admit, a highly preferable alternative to hanging by his ears from a post. The house in which Bryce and Sarah Ruth lived was so small and crooked that Edward did not believe at first that it could have been a house. He mistook it instead for a chicken coop. Inside, there were 2 beds and a kerosene lamp, and not much else. Bryce laid Edward at the front of one of the beds and then lit the lamp. That's what their house looks like. He thought it was a little chicken coop. "Sarah," Bryce whispered. "Sarah Ruth, you gotta wake up now, honey. I brung you something." He took the harmonica out of his pocket and played the beginning of a simple melody. A little girl sat up in her bed and immediately started to cough. Bryce put his hand on her back. "That's all right," he told her. "That's okay." She was young, maybe 4 years old, and she had white blonde hair, and even in that poor light of the lamp, Edward could see her eyes were the same gold-flecked brown as Bryce's. "That's right," said Bryce. "You go on ahead and cough." Sarah Ruth obliged him. She coughed and coughed and coughed. On the wall of the cabin, the kerosene lamp cast her trembling shadow. Hunched over and small, the coughing was the saddest sound that Edward had ever heard. Sadder even than the mournful call of that whippoorwill. Finally, Sarah Ruth stopped. Bryce said, "You want to see what I brung you?" Sarah Ruth nodded. You gotta close your eyes. The girl closed her eyes. Bryce picked up Edward and held him so that he was standing straight like a soldier at the end of the bed. All right, now you can open them. Sarah Ruth opened her eyes and Bryce moved Edward's china legs and china arms so it looked as if he were dancing. Sarah Ruth laughed and clapped her hands. Rabbit, she said. He's for you, honey, said Bryce. Sarah Ruth looked first at Edward and then at Bryce and then back at Edward again, her eyes wide and disbelieving. He's yours. Mine? Sarah Ruth, Edward was soon to discover, rarely said more than one word at a time. Words, at least several of them strung together, made her cough. She limited herself. She said only what she needed to say. Yours, said Bryce. I got him special for you. This knowledge provoked another fit of coughing in Sarah Ruth, and she hunched over again. When the fit was done, she uncurled herself and held out her arms. That's right, said Bryce. He handed Edward to her. Baby, said Sarah Ruth. She rocked Edward back and forth and stared down at him and smiled. Never in his life had Edward been cradled like a baby. Abilene had not done it, nor had Nellie, and most certainly Bull had not. It was a singular sensation to be held so gently, and yet so fiercely, to be stared down at with so much love. Edward felt the whole of his china body flood with warmth. You going to give him a name, honey? Bryce asked. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth without taking her eyes off Edward. Jangles, huh? That's a good name. I like that name. Bryce patted Sarah Ruth on the head. She continued to stare down at Edward. Hush, she said to Edward as she rocked him back and forth. From the minute I first seen him, said Bryce, I knew he belonged to you. I said to myself, that rabbit is for Sarah Ruth for sure. Jangles, murmured Sarah Ruth. Outside the cabin, thunder cracked, and then came the sound of rain falling on the tin roof. Sarah Ruth rocked Edward back and forth, and Bryce took out his harmonica and started to play, making his song keep rhythm with the rain. That was so good. So now he's going to love Sarah Ruth, and she's not going to live very long, it doesn't sound like. I hope you guys are enjoying this book. I've gotten a lot of feedback from some kids that they're really enjoying it. I just wanted to keep up consistently reading with you each day so you have this time. If it's a bedtime read aloud, then good night. If it's something to just break up your work day, then I'm happy to be here with you. I loved seeing you and your families yesterday around the teacher parade. That was the highlight of my week. I will see you guys tomorrow at our class meeting. It's our last class meeting, I believe, and it will be at 1 o'clock. We're going to be doing some fun stuff. See you then.